The deed hit the table between them like a gunshot. Lenora Covington did not flinch. She had not flinched when her father died and left her the land. She had not flinched when the lawyers in St. Louis told her no respectable court would honor the transfer to an unmarried woman. She had not flinched when she boarded the westbound train alone, her single trunk loaded with 3 dresses, a rifle, and every document her father had ever signed. But standing here in the cramped office of the Harlan County Land Registry, watching Nathan Finley stare at the paper she had slapped down in front of him, she felt something dangerously close to a flinch rising in her chest. "You came all the way from Missouri," he said, "for 412 acres of Wyoming scrub." "I came all the way from Missouri for my land," she said. "The deed names Covington. That is my name. I do not see where the law requires it to name a husband." Nathan looked up from the paper. He had gray eyes, not the soft gray of winter clouds, but the hard gray of river flint, and they swept across her face with an assessment she recognized as something other than dismissal. He was reading her, measuring the trap she might have walked into without knowing it. "It does not require a husband," he said slowly. "The law does not. But Deputy Marshal Calhoun has been telling every rancher from here to the Powder River that the Covington parcel is abandoned property, and he has filed a competing claim on behalf of a man named Ellsworth Breck." The name landed like a second gunshot. Lenora had heard that name before. Her father had spoken it with the particular careful silence that men use when they are describing something dangerous. Ellsworth Breck, the man who had tried twice to buy her father out. The man her father had refused. The man who, 3 weeks after her father's death, had written Lenora a letter offering condolences so oily she had felt she needed to wash her hands after reading it. "How long has Breck had this competing claim filed?" she asked. 6 weeks, Nathan said. 6 weeks. Her father had been dead for 8. That was when she understood the shape of the trap she had walked into. And that was when Nathan Finley, who ran the land registry office for Harlan County and who had every professional reason to simply stamp the competing claim and send her on her way, did something she had not expected. He picked up her deed, walked to the iron safe in the corner of the room, placed it carefully inside, and locked it. "Nobody touches this until we sort out what is legal and what is just theft wearing a badge," he said. She had not asked him to do that. She had not expected him to. And that unexpected act of protection, so quiet and so certain, was the first thread that would bind them together through 6 months of secrets, forced choices, dark revelations, and a love neither of them had anticipated surviving. But first, the story has to go back to its beginning. Back to 3 weeks earlier when Lenora Covington stepped off the train at Crail Station, Wyoming, with her trunk, her rifle, and a deed she had no intention of surrendering. The year was 1882. Wyoming Territory had passed its Women's Suffrage Act over a decade earlier, making it the first territory in the nation to grant women the vote and the right to hold property independently. Lenora had researched this. She was not a reckless woman. She was a deeply strategic one. She had chosen Wyoming specifically because the law here, at least on paper, was more honest about what a woman was allowed to own. What she had not fully calculated was the gap between what the law said and what men like Ellsworth Breck were willing to let happen. Crail Station was not much of a town. A main street, really, with a general store, a hotel that was barely more than a boarding house, a saloon whose smell carried 3 doors down in either direction, a small church that leaned slightly to the left, and at the end of the block, a narrow building with a hand-painted sign reading Land Registry, Harlan County, and Finley, Registrar. Lenora had walked straight there from the train platform, her trunk left with the station master, her rifle carried in the crook of her arm the way her father had taught her, easily, not threateningly, but with a clarity of purpose that said she knew exactly what it was for. The man inside the registry was not what she expected. She had expected a clerk, the doughy, ink-stained, spectacle-wearing variety. What she found was a lean man in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of weathered jaw that came from spending time outdoors despite working inside. He was copying entries into a ledger when she pushed the door open, and he looked up without the particular surprise that most men registered when a woman walked into a government office alone. "I need to register a land deed," she said. "That is what this office is for," he said, and set down his pen. That was the beginning. What happened next was straightforward in the mechanical sense. She presented her documents. He reviewed them with a care that she noted was thorough rather than performative. He was not looking for reasons to reject her claim. He was actually reading the documents. All of them. The original land grant from the territorial government to her father, James Elias Covington, dated 1876. The transfer deed her father had prepared in 1881, 6 months before his death, naming Lenora Ann Covington as sole heir and rightful owner of the property described as the Covington parcel, approximately 412 acres bordering Hawk Creek in the northern section of Harlan County. The death certificate, properly witnessed and sealed. "This is in order," Nathan said when he had finished. "I know it is," Lenora said. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly before you react." That sentence told her everything about his character. Not the words exactly, but the way he assumed she might react badly and chose to warn her rather than simply barrel forward. She gave him a nod. He explained about Ellsworth Breck, about the competing claim, about Deputy Marshal Calhoun, who was Breck's instrument in the county, and who had the authority to make life very complicated for anyone who tried to stand in the way of whatever Breck wanted. Who is this Nathan Finley, she had thought, watching him explain the situation with the kind of careful directness that respected her intelligence. And why is he being honest with me? The answer to that question took several weeks to emerge. Nathan Finley had come to Crail Station 4 years earlier, in 1878, under circumstances he did not volunteer and which the town, having the particular small community instinct for knowing when not to ask, had generally allowed him to keep private. What people knew was that he was good at the job, scrupulously honest about the records, and not for sale. 3 separate ranchers had attempted to bribe him at various points. None of them had succeeded, and all 3 had found that their attempts were quietly and precisely documented in a secondary ledger. He kept for exactly that purpose, a ledger that gave him the kind of quiet leverage that prevented future attempts. What people did not know, what remained his hidden secret, his dark past locked behind those flint-gray eyes, was that he had come to Crail Station specifically because of Ellsworth Breck. He had worked, years before, as a surveyor for a land company in Colorado. Breck had been a client of that company. Nathan had witnessed Breck's methods up close, had watched him use fraudulent surveys, compliant local officials, and strategic marriages forcing women into them, purchasing their compliance, using debt and threat and the particular social architecture of the frontier that left women desperately vulnerable, to accumulate land that was not rightfully his. Nathan had tried to report it. The company had fired him. Breck had threatened him. He had moved north, taken the registrar position in a county where Breck was not yet operating, and had spent 4 years keeping meticulous records, building relationships with the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne and waiting. He had not known what he was waiting for exactly, until the day a woman in a gray traveling dress walked into his office carrying a deed and a rifle, and looked at him with dark brown eyes that held not a single gram of neediness. She was not asking for rescue. She was asking for the law. There was a profound difference, and it mattered to him more than he could have said. Lenora, for her part, took a room at the Hartwell boarding house, the only establishment in Crail Station that accepted single women without requiring either a husband's name or an explanation, and began making her plans. She was 28 years old. She had managed her father's household since she was 17, after her mother's death, and then managed his business correspondence after his health declined. And she had developed, through those years of invisible management, a mind that organized information with a clarity that most men in the territory would have found unsettling if they had recognized it for what it was. Most of them did not. They saw a fine-looking woman, perhaps somewhat too direct in her gaze, and concluded she was either confused or stubborn. Both assessments were wrong in the ways that would eventually cost them. She needed, in the immediate term, three things. She needed the competing claim dealt with through legal channels before Breck could have it formally ratified, which would require documentation proving the claim was fraudulent. She needed to reach her land, which was 14 miles north of Crail Station, to assess its condition and establish visible, demonstrated occupancy. Because an abandoned property claim is harder to contest when the alleged abandonment is refuted by the presence of the owner actively living on the land. And she admitted to herself with some reluctance, local knowledge that she did not have. It was the third item that brought her back to Nathan Finley's office the following morning. He was already at his desk when she arrived. The door was open, which she took as indication that he was not opposed to early visitors. "I need to know the county," she said without preamble. "The land, the people, who owes Breck favors and who does not, where the boundaries of my property are actually marked versus where they might be marked on Breck's fraudulent survey, and who in this county is in a position to speak to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne with any authority." Nathan set down his pen. He looked at her for a long moment, that measuring, reading look she was beginning to recognize as his particular habit of taking time before responding, a quality she found she respected rather than resented. "That is a substantial request," he said. "I have a substantial problem," she said. "Sit down," he said. She did. And he talked. For 2 hours he laid out the geography of the county, the social dynamics, the specific players. He told her which ranchers were independent and which were Breck's creatures. He told her that Judge Alderson, the circuit court judge who rode into Harlan County 4 times a year, was an honest man with a formidable legal mind and a documented distaste for land fraud. He told her that Breck's competing claim had a weakness. It was based on a survey conducted by a man named Dobbs, who was Breck's personal surveyor and who had a documented history of filing surveys that conveniently differed from territorial baseline measurements in ways that always benefited his employer. "How do you know all this?" she asked. He hesitated. The hesitation was brief, but she caught it because she caught everything. "It is my job to know the county records," he said. "That is the true part of what you are not fully telling me," she said. Another pause, longer this time, and then unexpectedly a slight shift at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was something adjacent to rueful respect. "I have a personal history with Breck," he said. "I will tell you the details when they become relevant. What matters right now is that I have documentation that Dobbs is not a reliable surveyor, and I have the baseline territorial measurements for your parcel. If we can get an independent resurvey conducted before Breck's claim is reviewed by Judge Alderson's court, the fraudulent nature of his competing claim will be clear." "Can we get an independent surveyor before the court review?" "Judge Alderson rides into Crail Station in 5 weeks. If we move quickly, yes." 5 weeks. That was the timeline she was working with. "What do you want in return for helping me?" she asked. It was a direct question, and she meant it directly. She had lived long enough to understand that nothing came without cost, and she preferred to know the terms. He seemed to find the question somewhat startling, which itself told her something about him. He had not, apparently, been operating from a calculation of what he would get out of it. "Nothing," he said. "That is not an answer I trust," she said. "From anyone who has demonstrated they have their own reasons for wanting Breck's methods exposed." "Fair," he said. "What I want is the same thing you want. A county where the land records mean what they say, where a deed is a deed and not just a piece of paper that stronger men can overwrite. Your case, if it succeeds, sets a precedent. That is what I want." She studied him. He held her gaze without flinching or performing. He was simply there, in the particular solid way of someone who has nothing hidden in the immediate transaction, even if they have plenty hidden further back. "All right," she said. "Then we work together. But I need you to understand something. I am not looking for a protector. I am looking for a professional ally. The difference matters." "I understand it perfectly," he said, and for the first few weeks that was exactly what they were, professional allies. They made the 14-mile ride out to the Covington parcel together on the third day after her arrival, Nathan on his own horse, a steady roan gelding named Sherman, and Lenora on a capable mare she hired from the livery stable, a bay animal whose temperament was somewhat better than the liveryman had suggested. The ride took most of a morning, through country that shifted from the scrubby near-town terrain to something wilder and more beautiful as they moved north, the land rising in gentle rolls toward the distant Bighorn foothills, the sky enormous and particular blue above them. The parcel was in better condition than she had feared and worse than she had hoped. The cabin her father had built in 1876 was standing, solidly constructed, though it needed significant repair to the roof and one wall. There was a well that still produced clean water when Nathan worked the old pump handle for several long minutes. There was a barn that was structurally sound but badly needed new boards in several places. There were fences, some standing and some down, and the land itself was exactly as the deed described. A stretch of grass and brush country that Hawk Creek ran through in a meandering line, good water access, decent grazing land, and on the eastern edge, a stand of pine timber that her father had specifically mentioned as valuable. "Someone has been using this property," Nathan said, crouching by the fire pit outside the cabin. "This ash is not 6 years old." "Breck," she said, "probably his hands, running cattle through here most likely. Making use of the water and timber without any legal right to it." That made her jaw set in a particular way. She was not a woman who expressed anger loudly. She expressed it quietly in the particular controlled silence of someone who is deciding precisely what to do with the feeling rather than simply emitting it. "The cabin," she said. "Can it be made livable in a week?" He looked at her. "You are planning to move out here immediately. Immediate occupancy defeats an abandonment claim." "Yes." "It will take work. I know a man, Walt Gruber, honest carpenter, not one of Breck's, who could have the roof repaired in 2 days if we can get the materials out here." "Then let us get the materials," she said. That afternoon marked the beginning of the practical collaboration that slowly, over days and weeks, became something more. Walt Gruber came out with his tools and a young assistant. Nathan rode out most mornings on his way to other county business, checking progress, bringing supplies, occasionally working alongside Gruber himself when extra hands were needed, pulling rotted planks, carrying replacement lumber, showing a straightforward competence with physical work that suggested he had not always been a man who sat behind a desk. Lenora worked alongside them. She had never been a woman who stood to the side of physical labor while others performed it on her behalf, and she was not about to start now. She learned quickly which tasks she could do, and which genuinely required more strength than she had, and she applied herself to the former without apology and directed the latter without self-consciousness. Walt Gruber, after the first day's mutual uncertainty, concluded that she was the most efficient woman he had ever worked alongside, which was his highest category of professional compliment. At night she slept in the repaired cabin, her rifle beside her. She was not afraid exactly, but she was alert, which was the appropriate response to her actual situation, and the difference between fear and alertness is the difference between a person who cannot act and a person who is ready to. The threat came on the 8th day. She heard the horses before she saw them, 4 riders, coming from the west, the direction of Breck's main ranch. She was outside the cabin when they rode up, and she stood still with her hands loose at her sides, which was not where her rifle was, but nothing in her posture suggested that was a problem. The man in front was big, with a red face and a dense black mustache. He did not introduce himself, which told her everything. "This is Breck land," he said. "You need to get yourself gone." "I have a deed naming this as Covington land," she said, "registered with the Harlan County Land Registry. The competing claim supersedes your deed. The competing claim is under review. Until it is adjudicated by a court, my deed stands. You are trespassing, not me." The man's red face went a shade darker. The three men behind him shifted their horses in a way she recognized as a display of implied threat. She did not move. "Nobody adjudicates anything here except Mr. Breck," he said. "I suggest you take that position to Judge Alderson," she said, "when he arrives in 4 weeks. I will be happy to present my deed at the same time. In the meantime, this is my property and I would like you to leave it." She said this with such perfect, unhurried calm that there was a long moment where no one moved. The man on the horse was clearly someone accustomed to women who either broke into tears or backed down. She was doing neither, and the absence of either expected response seemed to confuse his instincts. "You will regret this," he said finally. "Perhaps," she said. "But that would be a future problem. Right now my position is clear. Goodbye." He held her gaze for another moment, then wheeled his horse and rode back the way he had come, his 3 companions following. She watched them go and then stood quietly for a few seconds, breathing deliberately, because the calm she had presented was real, but she was also human, and being threatened by 4 armed men is the kind of thing that requires a moment of honest reckoning afterward. She told Nathan about it the next morning when he rode out. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. "Redhurst," he said when she described the man. "Frank Redhurst, Breck's ranch foreman. He does whatever Breck tells him." "He will be back," she said, "with more men or with worse intent." "Yes," Nathan said without softening it. "We need to move faster on the surveyor." He had already been in correspondence with a surveyor in Buffalo, the nearest significant town, about 80 miles east. The man's name was Arthur Pease, and he was credentialed through the territorial government and had no prior relationship with Breck. Getting him to Harlan County within the timeline required resources, primarily money to cover his fee and travel, and it required a formal request through proper channels that Nathan, as county registrar, had the authority to make. "The fee is $12, Nathan said. "The territory will cover it if I file the proper request, but that takes time we do not have. If we pay him directly, he can be here within the week." $12 was not a trivial sum, but Lenora had brought her resources with her in the understanding that establishing her claim would have costs. "Send for him," she said. Arthur Pease arrived 9 days later, a slight man with an enormous mustache that compensated for his general smallness, carrying surveying equipment in 3 leather cases, and an attitude of precise professional detachment that Lenora found immediately reassuring. He spent 3 days measuring the Covington parcel, comparing his findings to the territorial baseline records that Nathan had obtained from Cheyenne, and produced a survey that agreed with the original grant description within 3 feet, which was exceptional accuracy, and which differed from Dobbs's competing survey by over 200 yards on the western boundary. A discrepancy that could not be accounted for by any instrument error, and which could only mean that Dobbs had deliberately moved the western boundary line to include, in Breck's competing claim, a substantial section of what was rightfully Covington land. "Is this documented clearly enough for court?" Lenora asked Pease. "A first-year law student could win this case with what I have found," Pease said. "The Dobbs survey is fraudulent. That is not my professional opinion. It is a mathematical fact." She paid Pease his $12 and he departed for Buffalo, his 3 leather cases loaded back into the wagon he had hired. She stood with Nathan on the porch of the repaired cabin in the late afternoon light, both of them holding the detailed comparison document Pease had produced. 3 weeks until Alderson," Nathan said. "We have everything we need," she said. "We have everything we need for the legal case. Breck does not fight solely through legal channels." She knew that. They both knew that. But there was a particular quality to saying it aloud, the 2 of them standing on the porch she had scrubbed clean, looking out at the land that bore her name on its deed, that made it feel like a shared problem rather than her problem alone. She noticed that. She noticed, more precisely, what it felt like to share a problem with someone whose competence and honesty she trusted completely, and she stored the feeling away in the part of her mind that was still primarily occupied with strategic calculation, but which was beginning to make room for something less calculated. It was Nathan who told her his history with Breck that evening. She had not pushed for it. He offered it, sitting at the small kitchen table while she made coffee on the cast iron stove she had purchased from the general store and hauled out herself on a borrowed mule cart. He told her about Colorado, about the land company, about the surveys he had watched Breck commission and corrupt, about a particular case, a widow named Harriet Morse, who had owned 160 acres in Garfield County, Colorado, who had been systematically defrauded of her land through a combination of false survey, a complicit local official, and eventually a forced sheriff's sale on a fabricated debt. Nathan had tried to intervene. He had gone to the territorial authorities. He had been told very clearly by the land company's attorney that he was a surveyor's assistant with no standing and considerable nerve, and that if he persisted he would find himself without employment and without professional reputation in the entire territory. He had persisted. He had lost both. Harriet Morse lost her land, he said. She had family in Kansas and she went to them. I heard later that she remarried. I do not know what became of the land. Breck has it somewhere in his accumulation. And you came here, Lenora said. Wyoming had an honest territorial land office. I got this position, I built the records up properly, and I waited. For what? He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them cast warm light that made his gray eyes look different, less like river flint and more like deep water. I did not know for what, he said. Not specifically. For the chance to do it right, I suppose. To have enough standing and enough documentation that when Breck moved into this county, and he was always going to, eventually, men like him expand until they are stopped, I would be in a position to actually stop him. And now he has moved in, she said. Now he has moved in, Nathan agreed. And you are here, with a legitimate deed and the particular stubbornness to use it. Is that what you call it, she said. Stubbornness. I call it that admiringly, he said. They looked at each other for a moment. The lamp flame moved slightly in a draft from the window gap she had not yet fully caulked. Outside, the Wyoming night was enormous and full of stars in a way that still surprised her, coming from the more moderate darkness of Missouri. Tell me about your father, Nathan said, which was not a question she had expected. She told him. James Covington had been a tall man, slow-moving, with enormous hands and a gentleness that he wore without apology in a world that often punished men for it. He had homesteaded the Wyoming parcel in 1876 with the intention of building something for Lenora to inherit. He had told her explicitly that he understood her disinclination toward marriage and that he refused to treat it as a deficiency. He had put her name on the transfer deed while he still had the health to do it properly. He had made sure she knew where every document was. He prepared me to stand on my own, she said. He thought that was the most useful thing he could give me. He was right, Nathan said quietly. The 3 weeks before Judge Alderson's arrival in Crail Station were not peaceful. Breck applied pressure through every channel available to him. Redhurst came back to the property twice more. The first time, Lenora's rifle was visible, and she made it clear she knew how to use it, which she did, her father having ensured she was competent with firearms from an early age. The second time, Redhurst brought 6 men instead of 4, and he brought a document signed by Deputy Marshal Calhoun claiming that the property was under protective custody pending the court review and that Lenora was required to vacate. She read the document. It was, she was nearly certain, fraudulent on its face. She told Redhurst that Deputy Marshal Calhoun does not have the authority to issue occupancy orders in a civil property dispute, she said. That authority belongs to the circuit court. I will be happy to discuss this matter with Judge Alderson. Until then, my position on this property remains legally protected. Redhurst did not push it to a physical confrontation. She thought he might have been told not to, that a violent removal would be harder to explain to a circuit court judge than a legal one. But she also thought he was the kind of man who would do it if ordered to, and she recognized that the restraint was tactical rather than ethical. She rode to Crail Station the following morning and reported the incident to Nathan. He was already composed and ready to act on the news. She suspected he had been anticipating it. "Calhoun's order is invalid," he said. "I will document it and write directly to the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne. Calhoun overstepped his authority, and a formal complaint will be on record before Alderson arrives. Will the Territorial Marshal act on it? Not before the court review, but the documentation matters. If Calhoun testifies in Alderson's court, and his unauthorized order is already on record with Cheyenne, his credibility is substantially reduced." This was the kind of thinking she respected. Not dramatic, not optimistic, not relying on anyone to ride in and save the day, but precise and methodical, and aimed at building the ground she needed to stand on. Deputy Marshal Calhoun came to see her directly the next day. He came alone, which she noted, and came to the land registry office where she happened to be working alongside Nathan on the documentation for the court hearing. Calhoun was a thin man with a prominent Adam's apple and the particular meanness of someone who has obtained a small authority and applies it maximally, because it is the only real power he will ever have. "Miss Covington," he said, with an emphasis on the miss that was intended to imply something, "you are causing trouble in this county." "I am exercising my legal rights in this county," she said. "Those are different things. Mr. Breck is a significant contributor to this community. Mr. Breck is filing a fraudulent land claim," she said. "I look forward to demonstrating that to Judge Alderson." Calhoun looked at Nathan. "You are sticking your neck out, Finley." "I am doing my job," Nathan said. "The records in this office are accurate. That is my obligation and my practice." "Your job is what the county needs it to be," Calhoun said. "The county needs it to be accurate," Nathan said, without raising his voice at all. "Same as always." Calhoun left. He slammed the door, which was the action of a man who has run out of effective options and is expressing his frustration through furniture. After he left, Lenora and Nathan were both quiet for a moment. "He threatened you," she said. "He implied a threat," Nathan said. "There is a difference." "The difference being what exactly?" "An implied threat gives me the opportunity to document it without acting as though I have been wounded by it," he said. "Which I have not been." She looked at him. He was arranging papers on his desk with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything, and she felt something shift inside her that she had been keeping carefully in its proper place for weeks. It was not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. It was something more specific and more dangerous. Something that had to do with the way she had been watching his hands as he worked, with the particular quality of attention he brought to everything she said, with the way he had never once, not once, in all these weeks, treated her land or her rights or her judgment as less than fully real and fully serious. She returned her own attention to the documents in front of her and said nothing. But she was aware, in the careful inventory of an honest person, that something had changed. The night before Judge Alderson's arrival, she could not sleep. She lay in the cabin on her narrow bed listening to the creek and the wind and the enormous Wyoming silence, turning the case over in her mind, looking for holes she might have missed. She also turned over something else. She was 28 years old. She had come to this territory deliberately unmarried, had come specifically because the law here gave her the right to hold property without a husband's name on the deed. She had planned her life to the extent one could plan a life, around the premise that she did not need a husband. Her father had supported that premise. She had believed it completely. She still believed it. That was the honest thing. She still believed she did not need a husband. What she was discovering, lying in the dark, was something distinct from need, the possibility that want and need were not the same thing. That choosing to want something was a different proposition entirely from being dependent on it. She did not sleep well. She rose early and saddled her horse and rode to Crail Station in the gray pre-dawn, arriving before the town was fully awake, sitting in front of the land registry office to wait. Nathan arrived an hour later and found her there. He stopped his horse and looked at her sitting on the step in the early morning light. "Could not sleep either," he said. "No," she said. "Come inside," he said. "I will make coffee," she did, and they sat across the small table from each other with coffee they had both needed badly and the case documents spread between them, and for a while they simply went over everything one more time for the reassurance of repetition. Then Nathan set down his cup and said, "After this is done." She looked up. "After the court hearing," he said. "When this is settled, I want to ask you something." "Ask it now," she said. He looked at her. That reading look, that measuring look, and then something in it that was different from the professional assessment she had come to expect. "After," he said. "There are things I cannot ask while I am acting in my official capacity in relation to your case. It would not be right." She understood that. She did not like waiting as a general principle, but she understood it. "Fair enough," she said. Judge Alderson was a large man in his late 50s, broad across the shoulders, with a white beard trimmed to a precise edge and eyes that were probably the sharpest in the territory. He arrived on the noon stage and convened an informal review session that afternoon in the town's largest available space, which was the saloon, cleared of its usual clientele and set with chairs and a table at the front. Breck was there in person. Lenora had not seen him before. He was perhaps 50, expensively dressed by frontier standards, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and had hardened into something merely domineering. He had 2 lawyers with him, which she noted. She had Nathan, which the 2 lawyers probably discounted, since he was not presenting himself as her legal counsel, but as the county registrar providing official documentation, which was, she understood, considerably more powerful than a lawyer. The session proceeded with a formality that Alderson enforced with quiet authority. Breck's attorneys presented the competing claim. They presented Dobbs's survey. Dobbs himself testified, with a confidence that Lenora judged was either genuine or very practiced. One of the lawyers made several arguments about abandonment that relied on a specific interpretation of territorial property law that Lenora felt was creative rather than accurate. Then Nathan presented the official county deed records. He presented Pease's independent survey, which he had arranged to be notarized through the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, giving it official territorial standing. He presented the mathematical comparison between Pease's measurements and Dobbs's, walking Alderson through the specific discrepancy with the calm, detailed precision of someone who thoroughly understood what he was looking at and trusted the judge to do the same. Lenora presented her own documents. She spoke for herself, clearly and without embellishment, laying out the chain of ownership from the original 1876 territorial grant through her father's transfer deed to her own name. When one of Breck's lawyers suggested, with a particular legal delicacy, that the transfer might be challengeable on grounds of the transferee's status, she looked at Judge Alderson directly and said, "Wyoming Territory extended the right of women to hold property independently in 1869. My deed names me as sole owner. The law of this territory is entirely clear." Alderson looked over his glasses at her. Then he looked at Breck's lawyers with an expression that did not require translation. The session took 4 hours. Alderson retired to consider the matter, which took another 2 hours. When he returned, his verdict was delivered with the concise efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he thought and saw no reason to elaborate beyond what the situation required. The competing claim was dismissed. The Dobbs survey was declared fraudulent and ordered expunged from the county records. The matter of Calhoun's unauthorized occupancy order was referred to the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne for review of the deputy marshal's conduct. Breck was ordered to pay the costs of the independent resurvey. The Covington deed stood exactly as written. The room was not the sort of place where cheering happened, but there was a particular quality of silence when Alderson finished speaking that was as satisfying, Lenora thought, as applause. She looked at Breck. He was staring at the table in front of him with the flat expression of a man who is already calculating his next move rather than accepting his defeat. She noted that. She filed it away. She understood that a man like Breck did not stop. He simply redirected. Nathan was at her side as people began moving. He touched her arm lightly once to catch her attention and said, very quietly, "Well done." "The same to you," she said. Outside in the long evening light of a Wyoming summer, the town felt different around her. Lighter, perhaps, more real. She had a deed and now she had a legal record that confirmed it, and the land 14 miles north was genuinely, unambiguously, legally hers. "You wanted to ask me something," she said to Nathan. They were standing on the boardwalk outside the saloon. The rest of the people from the session were dispersing around them. He looked at her for a moment. "I wanted to ask," he said, "whether you would walk with me." It was such a modest request after everything that she almost laughed. She did not. She nodded. They walked through the town in the evening light, past the general store and the listing church and the hotel and the registry office with its hand-painted sign, and out to the edge of the town where the land opened up in its vast Wyoming way. They walked without a particular destination, and they talked not about the case, not about Breck, not about legal strategy or documentation, but about other things. His early life in Ohio, her childhood in Missouri with her father. Books they had both read, which turned out to be a surprising number of the same ones. The particular quality of Wyoming light that neither of them had been prepared for when they arrived. "You are planning to stay," he said, not a question. "Obviously," she said. "I spent $12 on a surveyor and I have a roof that needed replacing. I am not leaving." He smiled. A real one, full, the kind she had seen very rarely from him in the weeks of their acquaintance, because he was a careful man with his expressions as with everything else. She was struck by what it did to his face, how it made the hardness in it into something quite different. "What I actually wanted to ask," he said, "is whether you would allow me to call on you." She looked at him. "I am aware," he said, choosing his words with the same deliberate care she had come to associate with him, "that you came here specifically for the right to hold your land without a husband's name attached to it. I am not asking about that. I would not ask about that. What I am asking is whether you would permit me to spend time in your company in a way that is not entirely about legal strategy." She was quiet for a moment. "You understand," she said, "that I do not intend to change the nature of my deed. My land stays in my name. Whatever else may or may not develop, that does not change." "I would think less of you if you were willing to change it," he said simply. That, she thought, was the most precisely correct thing anyone had ever said to her. "Then yes," she said, "you may call." The summer moved through its long, sun-filled days, and Nathan did call. He called at the Hartwell boarding house when Lenora was in town, which was several days a week, and he rode out to the property on Sunday afternoons, which became a particular ritual that both of them looked forward to without discussing the fact that they looked forward to it. He would arrive to find her working. She was always working, building fence, tending the kitchen garden she had planted, managing the small herd of cattle she had purchased with the remainder of her financial resources, and he would tie his horse and help with whatever she was doing, and they would talk. They talked about everything. She was surprised by him, repeatedly. He had opinions about things she had not expected, about the treatment of the Shoshone and Arapaho peoples whose land this territory had originally been, which he expressed with a straightforwardness and an acknowledgment of injustice that few men she had met were willing to articulate. He had read more books than his professional life easily explained. He had a dry humor that emerged slowly, in small doses, like something he had learned to ration, and once she began to recognize it, she found it genuinely funny, which was a quality she valued highly because she had a sharp appreciation for the absurd and most men did not match it. She was surprised, also, by the quality of her own pleasure in his company. She had, for most of her adult life, found that the pleasure of solitude exceeded the pleasure of most company. She had accepted this as a fact of her character rather than a deficiency. What she was discovering, over these Sunday afternoons and the occasional evenings when he stayed for supper, and they sat on her porch watching the stars emerge, was that what she had been measuring was not solitude against company, but the solitude she actually wanted against company that consistently failed to reach the standard she set for it. Nathan reached the standard. In late August, Breck moved again. Not through legal channels this time. Nathan had been right to worry about that. 2 of Breck's men cut Lenora's western fence line during the night, driving 24 head of cattle through onto her land and leaving them there. It was the kind of move designed to be difficult. The cattle were unmarked, which made ownership complicated to establish, and having them on her land without invitation created a legal gray area that a sufficiently creative lawyer might exploit. She drove them off herself with her horse and considerable determination, restaked the fence line, and documented the fence damage in writing. She told Nathan the next day. He was quiet for a longer time than usual after she finished. "Breck is not going to stop," he said. "He lost the court case, but he is shifting tactics. This is harassment. The goal is to make the land too much trouble to hold." "He misjudges me," she said. "I know that. He does not know it yet. Then we will teach him." The teaching came in the form of a formal complaint to the Territorial Land Office, a civil claim for property damage and trespass filed through Judge Alderson's court by Nathan acting in his official capacity, and a letter from Lenora to the Wyoming Territorial Governor's office that was so precisely and devastatingly written that Nathan read it twice and looked at her with something in his expression she had not seen before. "Did you write this yourself?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Was there a reason you would think I had not?" "There was not," he said. "It is remarkable." The formal complaints and the governor's office letter combined to produce an investigation into both Breck's land practices generally and Calhoun's conduct specifically. Breck had enough political connection to slow things down, but he could not stop them entirely. Calhoun resigned his position in October before he could be removed, a distinction that Lenora regarded as nearly irrelevant, since the outcome was the same. Breck's harassment of her property stopped, abruptly, in the first week of September. She suspected this was because someone had explained to him that further incidents would appear in the ongoing investigation in a way that would complicate his other land holdings in the territory. The land was quiet after that. The fall came in with a kind of magnificence she had not expected, the grass going gold and amber, the distant peaks acquiring their first snow, the creek dropping a little in its banks as the summer flows receded. She spent October and November improving the property. She bought 2 more cattle. She hired a local man named Pete Harmon, who was reliable and good with animals, to help manage the herd through the winter. She winterized the cabin properly, laying in firewood and supplies, insulating the walls. Nathan came every Sunday, and then increasingly on Saturday afternoons as well, and then on certain evenings in the week when the registry was closed and the 14-mile ride each direction seemed to him, apparently, worth it. She never asked him to come more often. He simply did. The first time he kissed her was in October, on a Saturday afternoon, in the barn, of all places, where she had been showing him a problem with one of the cattle's hooves, and they had been standing close together looking at the animal's leg, and had both straightened up at the same moment, and found themselves suddenly near enough that the question was not really a question at all. He stopped just before and looked at her, with that asking quality in his expression that she had come to understand was his form of requesting permission. She answered it by closing the remaining distance herself. It was not a shy kiss. She had never been shy, not fundamentally, and the months of accumulated feeling behind it gave it a weight that was almost surprising even to her. He responded with a warmth and a certainty that told her he had been carrying as much weight as she had, and they stood in the afternoon light of her barn being entirely honest about it for a good while. When they separated, she looked at him directly, and he looked at her with that changed expression that the smile produced, that softness in a face usually composed and steady. And neither of them said anything for a moment because nothing particularly needed to be said. "I should make supper," she said eventually. "I will help," he said. They walked back to the cabin and she made supper and he helped, and it was, she thought, as good an afternoon as she had ever spent in her life. November brought harder cold and shorter days, and a development she had not anticipated. Nathan confided that the Breck investigation had expanded. The Territorial Attorney General's office had become involved. There were indications that Breck's land frauds extended significantly beyond Harlan County and beyond Wyoming territory. That the Colorado situations Nathan had witnessed were part of a broader pattern, documented now in 4 territories, involving perhaps a dozen fraudulent surveys, multiple complicit local officials, and properties taken from at least 8 other individuals in circumstances similar to both Harriet Morse in Colorado and Lenora herself. "Will it reach a criminal charge?" she asked. "The Attorney General seems to believe so. Fraud, conspiracy, potentially more if the forced sales are examined carefully." He paused. "He wants testimony from me about what I saw in Colorado." "Will you give it?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I should have given it years ago. I was not in a position to make it stick. Now I am. You will have to travel to Cheyenne. For a week, probably in December." She nodded. She did not tell him she would miss him. She was still, even now, a person who preferred to demonstrate feelings through action rather than declaration. But she thought about it in the way she thought about many things, honestly and without flinching from the conclusion. "Come back," she said, which was not the same as saying she would miss him, but was not entirely different either. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she had stopped reading as cold and now read as something more like deep and still. "I will come back," he said. "Lenora." He rarely said her name. He used it deliberately, carefully, and hearing it in his voice did something she was by now entirely willing to admit to, at least in the privacy of her own thoughts. He went to Cheyenne in December and he came back in 12 days, which was 5 days sooner than he had estimated. She did not ask him why. She saw from his face when he arrived at her door in the late afternoon that the testimony had been difficult and that he was glad to be here rather than anywhere else, and she simply opened the door wider and said, "Come in. Supper is nearly ready." He sat at her table and the tension went out of his shoulders like something being carefully set down. "Thank you," he said. "For supper," she said. "For this," he said, meaning the whole of it, the cabin, the lamplight, her presence, the particular quality of here that was different from everywhere else. She sat down across from him and looked at him steadily. "Nathan," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am going to say something that I have been working up to saying for some time." He waited. "I did not come to this territory looking for anyone," she said. "I want to be clear about that. My intentions were entirely independent and they remain so. My land is mine and my name is mine, and I built what I have built here by my own design and my own work, and none of that changes." "I know," he said. "But I have also been, for some months now, quite thoroughly in love with you," she said, with the same calm directness she brought to every honest thing. "And I thought you should know that." He was quiet for a moment. She watched his face move through something complex and come out the other side of it. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since approximately the 3rd day of your acquaintance with me, when you drove 4 of Breck's men off your property with nothing but your voice and your absolute refusal to be intimidated. And I told myself it was unprofessional to think about it, and went on thinking about it constantly." She felt something open in her chest that she recognized as what people meant when they described happiness as a physical sensation. "That is unfortunate for your productivity," she said. "Catastrophically," he said. "I have had to recopy several ledger entries." She laughed. "A real one." He smiled, and it was that full, complete smile that she had decided months ago was one of the finest things she had ever seen. "What do we do about this?" he said, not presumptuously, genuinely asking. "I have thought about it," she said. "I imagined you had. I do not want to change the deed, she said. The deed stays. My name, my land, my right to it, independent of any other arrangement. Absolutely, he said. But I am reconsidering some other aspects of the arrangements I had imagined for myself, she said. Not out of dependence, not out of social pressure. Entirely because the specific person sitting across my kitchen table is someone I would be extraordinarily glad to have there every day. He looked at her across the lamp and the nearly ready supper, with an expression that contained everything she had come to read in him, the care, the honesty, the precise steadiness of someone who would not say things he did not mean or make promises he did not intend to keep. Then let me be there every day, he said, if that is what you want. On whatever terms make sense to you. I have no interest in the legal architecture of it beyond what you choose. The part that matters to me is you. She was quiet for a moment. She realized, making a decision she had not thought she would ever make. Not because she had been forced to it or frightened into it or because she had run out of alternatives, but because she had been given enough freedom and enough time and enough honest company to reach it on her own terms. I think, she said, that I would like to be married, to you specifically. With the very clear understanding that my deed does not change and my land does not change, and my name is the name on the property regardless of what other names I might choose to add or not add to my own. Wyoming law supports all of that, he said. I know it does. I researched it. She paused. Will you ask me properly? He got up from the chair across the table. He came around to her side and crouched down, which was not quite the formal posture the occasion might conventionally call for, but was very like him, practical, direct, unwilling to perform what he could simply do sincerely. Lenora Covington, he said, will you marry me? On your terms, with your name on your deed, with no expectation other than the extraordinary privilege of being the person you choose to come home to. She looked at him for one long moment, savoring the absolute particular rightness of it. Yes, she said. They were married in February of 1883, in the Crail Station church that leaned slightly to the left, by the Reverend August Cole, who was a decent man with a straightforward theology, and no objection to the specific language that Lenora required in the ceremony, language that explicitly noted that the marriage did not alter or transfer any existing property holdings. A provision that Reverend Cole found somewhat unusual and incorporated with good grace. There were perhaps 20 people present, which was most of the town who were genuinely well-disposed toward either of them, and Walt Gruber, who had repaired Lenora's roof and had developed a proprietary fondness for the whole enterprise, wept quietly and unashamedly throughout. Nathan wore his best suit, which was dark blue and freshly pressed, and his hair was cut properly for the occasion. Lenora wore a deep green dress she had ordered from the dressmaker in Buffalo 4 months ago, in a moment of private acknowledgement that some things were worth preparing for even before you were certain of them. She carried no flowers. She had considered it and decided that it was not particularly her style. She carried instead a folded piece of paper in her left hand, which was the deed to her property, which she had brought deliberately, and which she placed in her coat pocket at the appropriate moment in the ceremony, which was not traditional but was exactly right. The reception was held at the Hartwell boarding house, Mrs. Hartwell being an enthusiastic supporter of the match. There was food and there was dancing, fiddle music played by 2 men from the east end of the county, and there was a particular moment late in the evening when Nathan danced with Lenora, and the room around them went slightly soft and distant, the way rooms do when something occupying all your attention is happening in the space of 2 feet. You planned this very carefully, he said while they danced. I plan everything carefully, she said, including loving me. That one I did not plan, she said. That one happened to me despite my best organizational efforts. He turned her and brought her back, and his eyes were doing that deep-water thing they did when he was most himself. I am glad it did, he said. So am I, she said, profoundly. They lived on the Covington parcel. It had always been clear to both of them that this was where they would be. Nathan gave up his registry office position in the spring, which had the logistical challenge of needing a replacement, resolved by recommending a young man from Buffalo who had been assisting the Territorial Land Office and who was honest and competent in the specific way Nathan had required. He was not without occupation. He had built, quietly over his years in Crail Station, a knowledge of survey work and property law that was sufficiently rare in the territory that he found himself in demand as a private consultant, a profession that allowed him to work largely from the land they shared, and to travel occasionally to Buffalo or Cheyenne when a case required it. The land itself began to become what her father had envisioned for it. They expanded the cattle herd carefully and methodically. They repaired and then expanded the barn. Lenora planted a proper kitchen garden and then a larger one, discovering that the soil along the creek was richer than she had expected and that she had, apparently, inherited her father's aptitude for growing things. Nathan proved to have a genuine talent for cattle management, which surprised him more than it surprised her, since she had suspected from fairly early on that his practical competence extended considerably beyond legal documentation. Pete Harmon stayed on as a year-round hand. They hired a second man in the summer of 1883, a quiet Crow man named Thomas River Running who was, Pete confirmed with complete confidence, the best horseman in the county and possibly the territory. Thomas had his own complicated relationship with this land that was foundational and unignorable. His people had ranged this entire country before the treaties, before the territory, before any deed named any owner, and Nathan and Lenora treated him with the honesty that the situation required, which was to say they acknowledged the injustice openly, and paid him fairly, and consulted his knowledge of the land with the respect it deserved. Breck's legal situation resolved in the spring of 1884. The Territorial Attorney General filed charges of fraud and conspiracy against Ellsworth Breck in February, drawing on Nathan's testimony and the testimony of 4 other witnesses in 2 territories. Breck retained expensive attorneys and the proceedings moved slowly, as such proceedings always did, but the outcome, when it came in October of 1884, was decisive. Ellsworth Breck was convicted on 6 counts of land fraud and sentenced to 7 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. Several of the properties he had fraudulently obtained were ordered restored to their original owners where those owners could be identified and found. Harriet Morse, the widow from Colorado, was located in Kansas. She had remarried and her circumstances were not desperate, but the letter Nathan wrote her, explaining that the land could be restored to her if she wished to pursue it, arrived on a Tuesday morning, and she wrote back within the week that yes, she very much wished to pursue it, and the legal process of restoration was set in motion. Nathan told Lenora about Harriet Morse's letter in their kitchen on a September evening, before the verdict had come in. He told her that it had been, in some way he found hard to articulate, the resolution he had been waiting for since Colorado. Not the satisfaction of seeing Breck convicted, though that was coming and he would be glad of it. Something more specific, the particular wrong undone. He stole from her and she gets it back, Lenora said. As much of it as the years allow, he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat like that in the lamplight for a while, in the particular comfortable intimacy of 2 people who have learned to be in the same space without needing to fill every moment with words. Their son was born in the summer of 1884, in the cabin on the Covington parcel, attended by Mrs. Clara Beach, the county midwife, and by Nathan, who was present in the way Lenora had said she wanted him to be, which was present, not removed to another room in the manner conventionally expected of fathers. She delivered the baby with the same focused intensity she brought to difficult tasks, and when it was done and the baby was placed in her arms and she looked down at him, she felt something she had no prior precise experience of, which was the specific love one feels for a person who has existed for 12 minutes. They named him James, after her father. James Elias Finley, which was Nathan's surname but was followed immediately on the document by a middle name that was Covington, making his full registered name James Covington Finley, which satisfied both of them completely. Nathan held his son for the first time, and his face did something it had never done before in Lenora's experience, which was to become entirely unguarded. Every layer of the careful, steady, composed man she loved simply fell away, and what was underneath was something raw and wondering that she found so unexpectedly moving she had to look away for a moment. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. James looked at him with the unfocused, enormous seriousness of the recently born. "He looks at you like you're doing something suspicious," Lenora said. "He has your instincts," Nathan said, without looking up. She laughed, which hurt and was worth it. The parcel became a proper ranch in the years that followed. Not large by the standards of the cattle barons who were reshaping the territory in the 1880s, but solid and well managed, with a reputation for honest dealing and a herd that improved with each season. Lenora ran the business side of it with the organizational precision that had always been her particular gift, keeping records that would have satisfied any accountant, tracking expenditures and returns and improvement costs with a clarity that Pete Harmon said was why he stayed. He always knew where things stood. Nathan's consulting work grew steadily. His reputation for honesty and precision spread through the territory in the way that genuinely useful reputations do, by word of mouth, from one person to another who needed exactly what he provided. He was away perhaps 2 weeks in 5, traveling to various counties on survey and property law matters, and when he was fully home, present in the particular way of someone who knows the difference between being somewhere and being there. Lenora added 2 rooms to the cabin in 1885, which had become necessary given James's vigorous presence and the general expansion of their life. She directed the construction herself, which Walt Gruber, now 60 and somewhat slower but still precise with a saw, accepted as the correct and natural order of things. Their daughter was born in 1886. They named her Margaret, which was Lenora's mother's name, and called her Maggie almost immediately, because the name suited the particular personality she announced from her first weeks, which was expansive and loud and entirely unconcerned with what anyone thought about any of it. James, 2 years old by then, regarded his sister with an expression of solemn judgment that broke into delighted laughter the first time she grabbed his finger. Lenora found that she loved being a mother with a completeness she had not predicted, which she thought about honestly, as she thought about everything. She had not ruled out motherhood, but she had not centered it in her self-conception, and what she discovered was that it was possible to love it completely without it replacing or diminishing the other things she was. She was still a rancher. She was still the woman whose name was on the deed. She was still someone who read everything she could lay hands on and had opinions about most of it. Motherhood added to this. It did not edit it. Nathan proved to be the father she had suspected he would be when she had watched him with James, patient, present, consistently showing up in the specific way that mattered more than grand gestures. He had a way of taking James's childhood questions with complete seriousness that resulted in James, by age 5, having an impressive and somewhat alarming collection of information about geological formation, water tables, and property law. Maggie, by contrast, was most interested in horses and in doing everything her brother did faster. The summer of 1887 was a good one. The cattle market was strong. The legal matter of Harriet Morse's land had been resolved. She had decided not to return to Colorado, but had sold the restored land and used the money to establish herself properly in Kansas. And Nathan had received a letter from her in which she thanked him in terms that said more about what the restoration had meant than any legal or financial accounting could. He kept the letter in the iron safe that now stood in the study of the expanded cabin, where the land documents lived. In the evenings of that good summer, Lenora and Nathan sat on the porch they had built when they extended the cabin, in chairs they had bought from the furniture maker in Buffalo, watching the light go off the mountains in its particular way. James would be in bed by that point. Maggie was always the last of them to agree that it was time to sleep, and usually had to be carried inside. Nathan would manage this, coming back out and sitting beside Lenora in the darkening evening air, and they would talk or not talk as the occasion required. It was one such evening in August that Nathan said, "I have been thinking about something." "Tell me," she said. "I have been thinking about the fact that I am, professionally, at a point where I could be more useful to more people if I was working in an official capacity," he said. "There is going to be a territorial land commissioner position established in Cheyenne. It would involve overseeing property records across the whole territory, preventing what happened here from happening in other counties." She looked at him. "Cheyenne is 300 miles away," she said. "I know. The position would require some residence there. It is not the plan I would choose if I were designing things purely for personal preference." "But," she said, "but it is the work that needs doing," he said. "And I think I could do it well, and I wanted to ask you what you thought before I considered it further." She was quiet for a while, looking at the mountains. He waited. "I think," she said, "that we should go to Cheyenne together and look at what the position actually requires. And I think if it is what you say it is probably the right thing. And I think this land does not go anywhere. Pete Harmon can manage the ranch. Thomas knows every inch of this property. We can be here in summers. You would be willing to relocate." "I would be willing to do what makes sense," she said, "which this might. I want to see it before I decide." "That is a very you answer," he said. "I am a very me person," she said. He reached over in the dark and took her hand. She turned her hand over to hold his, which was the gesture of someone entirely willing to be held. "I love this land," she said. "I want you to know that I love it not because my name is on the deed, though that matters. I love it because I came here knowing nothing and built something. That does not diminish whether we are here every day or not." "I know," he said. "It is yours in a way that has nothing to do with paper." "Exactly," she said. They went to Cheyenne in September. The whole family, Nathan, Lenora, James, and Maggie, who was fascinated by the train in a way that James considered slightly beneath his dignity, but was also, secretly, equally fascinated by. The Territorial Land Commissioner's office was in the Capitol building, and the officials who presented the position to Nathan did so with an awareness that they were talking to someone who had built one of the most accurate and fraud-resistant county land record systems in the territory. The position was real. The scope was real. The need was real. Nathan would be overseeing record-keeping standards, investigating irregularities, and establishing protocols that would prevent the kind of systematic fraud that Breck had practiced across multiple counties. Lenora met the territorial governor at a reception during that visit. He was a practical man who treated her with the directness of someone accustomed to Wyoming women's particular brand of independence. They discussed the land commissioner position, and she asked several questions about the actual legal authority it would carry, and the governor answered them with sufficient specificity that she came away satisfied. She told Nathan that evening in their hotel room while the children were asleep in the adjoining room and the city's particular sounds came through the window that she thought he should take the position. "We will keep the land," she said. "We will come back in summers and Pete and Thomas will manage things properly. You can do important work here, real work, the kind that prevents the next Breck." "And you," he said. "I will find work here that is mine," she said. "I am not going to sit in a city and manage a household and nothing else. There will be things to do. There are always things to do for people who are willing to do them." She was right. By the spring of 1888, established in Cheyenne in a proper house they rented near the Capitol building, Lenora had identified that the Wyoming territorial government was in the early stages of discussions about formalizing women's property rights in anticipation of statehood, which Wyoming was moving toward. She attached herself to those discussions, initially as an interested citizen at public meetings. And then, because she arrived at every meeting more thoroughly informed than anyone else present and spoke about the practical realities of women holding frontier property with an authority born of direct experience, as something that functioned like an unofficial advisor. Her name, eventually, appeared in the correspondence of the committee examining property rights, cited by multiple committee members as a source of practical knowledge on the subject. This was not a paid position. It was something more durable. It was the kind of recognition that builds into permanent record. Nathan's work at the Land Commissioner's office was exactly what he had hoped it would be. He spent the first year establishing record systems. He spent the second year training county registrars across the territory. He spent the third year investigating and resolving 6 different property fraud cases in 4 different counties, none of them as dramatic as Breck, but each of them carrying the particular weight of a wrong righted and a right confirmed. He and Lenora worked, in Cheyenne, in the same overlapping way they had in Harlan County, parallel, complementary, each entirely competent in their own lane and genuinely interested in what the other was doing. They had dinner together most evenings and talked about their days and read in the evenings in the same room. James, now school age, attended the territorial school, where he was academically distinguished and socially precise, which were his parents' traits compressed into one child. Maggie attended school also, with considerably more chaos in the surrounding radius, and loved every moment of it. Wyoming became a state in July of 1890. There was a celebration in Cheyenne that was genuine and exuberant, the particular relief of a territory that has been waiting for formal recognition, settling into the atmosphere of the city like a long breath finally released. The new state constitution, drafted in the year before, had incorporated the provisions for women's property rights and suffrage that the territory had pioneered, making them not merely territorial policy but constitutional guarantee. Lenora stood in the crowd outside the Capitol building on Statehood Day and felt something she identified, after a moment's consideration, as vindication. Not personal vindication, something larger, the vindication of a principle. That the right to hold what you build, to name what is yours, to stand on your own land in your own name, was now written into the foundational law of an American state. Nathan found her in the crowd, which was not easy, and stood beside her. "How does it feel?" he said. "Like something that should have been true everywhere always, but at least is true here now," she said. He was quiet with her for a moment, watching the celebration. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known," he said. "Not the most remarkable woman, the most remarkable person. And I am aware that I say that with the particular bias of someone completely in love with you, but I believe it is objectively true as well." She looked at him for a long moment. She was 40 years old and he was 38, and they had been married for 7 years, and she found that she loved him with a depth that had accumulated over those years in the particular way of something truly known, with all its specificity and weight. "You are rather remarkable yourself," she said. "For a man who once told me the only thing he wanted was accurate land records. I have expanded my ambitions," he said. "Clearly," she said, and took his arm, and they stood together in the July sun while Wyoming became a state around them. They returned to the Covington parcel every summer as they had planned. The ranch under Pete Harmon's management had continued to grow steadily. Thomas River Running had taken on more responsibility over the years and was, by the early 1890s, effectively the operations manager of the place, a title and a compensation that Nathan and Lenora formalized explicitly, and which Pete and Thomas both acknowledged was the arrangement that actually described what had been true for some time. James, at 8, at 9, at 10, spent summers learning the land from Thomas, with an intensity that Thomas found pleasing and Lenora found encouraging. He was going to know this land the way she had wanted to know it when she arrived, from the inside, through direct experience. Maggie preferred the horses to the cattle, and was by age 7 a more confident rider than many adults, which Thomas acknowledged was simply a fact. A third child came in the summer of 1892. They had not been specifically planning for another, but life on the frontier, as Lenora had learned, did not always consult your planning documents. This one was a boy again. They named him William, after Nathan's father, who had died while they were in Colorado, and whose name Nathan had carried quietly with him for years. William Covington Finley, solid in his name as in his person, arrived in the Cheyenne house in August and proceeded to stake a thorough claim on the household's available attention. Lenora recovered quickly, which was her general approach to difficulty, and was back at her territory, by now quite formal, since the post-statehood period was generating substantial work around women's legal rights, and she was deeply embedded in it, within 6 weeks. Nathan managed an extended stay in Cheyenne between assignments, which gave him the particular pleasure of the first months of a new child's life in which he had always been most himself. 3 children, she said to him one evening, William asleep across her lap, James reading at the table, Maggie long since deposited into her bed with the ceremony that her departures from the evening always required. "We appear to be capable," he said from across the room. "We appear to have exceeded my original projections for this enterprise," she said. "Your original projections did not include me," he said. "They did not," she agreed. "Which shows the limit of projections." He smiled. The full smile. 7 years and she still thought it was one of the finest things she had ever seen. Nathan eventually left the land commissioner position in 1894, not because the work was done, but because the systems he had built were solid enough to sustain without him, and because there was a new opportunity that suited both of them better, a private law practice in Crail Station, focusing on property law and land rights, which would allow them to return to the county where they had started and to the land that bore her name. James was 12 by then, Maggie 10, William 2, and the decision to return to the country they both knew best was easy. Crail Station was larger than it had been in 1882. Still not large by any significant measure, but grown a proper school now, a second general store, a doctor's office that was not also the barber's, a bank. The old hand-painted registry office sign was gone, replaced by a painted wood sign for the new registrar, who was the same young man Nathan had recommended from Buffalo and who had over the years maintained exactly the standard Nathan had established. They came back to the Covington parcel in the spring. The house was larger now. Pete and Thomas had managed several expansions over the decade, guided by Lenora's detailed instructions from Cheyenne and funded from the ranch's steady proceeds. It was a proper house by now, timber-framed and solid, with a wide porch that looked north toward the Bighorn foothills and a kitchen large enough to actually work in and bedrooms enough for 3 children who were all, in their different ways, capable of filling the space they occupied. Nathan set up his law practice in Crail Station. Lenora ran the ranch. Not in the sense that she sat at a desk supervising, in the sense that she knew every operation, made the decisions, reviewed the accounts, and spent a substantial portion of each day working the land alongside Pete and Thomas and, increasingly, James, who at 12 was old enough to genuinely contribute and deeply interested in doing so. Maggie, whenever she could escape school, was on horseback, which was most effectively her natural state. In 1896, James Covington Finley turned 14 and formally asked to be taught survey work. He had been reading his father's books on the subject for 2 years already. Nathan began teaching him on Sunday mornings, taking him out with the equipment and walking him through the calculations, and discovered within 3 weeks that his son was not just competent but gifted, that he had inherited Lenora's spatial and mathematical mind in a form specifically suited to the discipline. "He is going to be very good at this," Nathan told Lenora. "He is going to be good at whatever he chooses to be good at," she said. "He has your persistence and my sense of direction." "That is a formidable combination." "What about Maggie?" he said. Maggie is going to run something, Lenora said with complete confidence. She does not know what yet, neither do I. But it will be something significant, and she will run it directly into the ground at full speed until it does exactly what she wants. Nathan laughed, which was now more often and more easily than it had been when she had first known him, the carefulness relaxed by years of being known by someone who valued what was underneath it. William, at 4, had not yet revealed his particular genius, but he had shown a pronounced interest in animals that Thomas was already encouraging in the particular quiet way that Thomas encouraged things, by simply including him and answering his questions with complete seriousness. The parcel, the Covington parcel, always and still the Covington parcel, named so on the deed, and so in everything continued to be what it had been, which was Lenora's land in every sense. She had built it from a neglected property with a rotted roof and a fraudulent claim against it into a working ranch that turned a reliable profit, raised 3 children, sustained 2 full-time employees and a professional practice, and had served as the ground on which a legal principle had been confirmed that mattered well beyond its immediate boundaries. She thought about that sometimes in the evenings on the porch, with the mountains doing what the mountains always did in the evening light, which was to become something so extraordinary that it felt unfair to call it merely beautiful. She thought about the woman who had arrived at Crail Station with a deed and a rifle and a trunk, in 1882, in the absolute certainty that the law entitled her to stand on this land. She thought about how that certainty had been tested and had held. She thought about all the things she had not predicted: the gray-eyed man in the registry office, the children, the years in Cheyenne, the friends built slowly and kept carefully, the shape a life takes when you stop imagining it in advance and start simply building it as you go. She was not a sentimental woman. She had never been. But she was, in the truest sense, a grateful one, grateful for the specific shape of what had happened, which was in every particular better than what she had planned. One evening in the late summer of 1897, when James was 15 and Maggie 13 and William 5, and the ranch was at its best, the sky doing something magnificent to the northwest with the particular colors of a high country sunset, Nathan came out onto the porch and sat in the chair beside her and said nothing for a while, which was his right and hers. Then he said, "Are you happy?" She looked at him. 15 years from that first day when she had slapped her deed on his table. 14 years married, 3 children who were entirely themselves, this land, this house, these mountains. Yes, she said, deeply and particularly and without reservation. He took her hand. "So am I," he said. The creek ran along the north edge of the property in its particular voice, lower now in late summer, and the cattle were out on the eastern pasture, and somewhere in the barn one of the horses made the soft sound horses make when they are settling for the evening, and the stars began to appear in the Wyoming sky with the absolute lavishness that had surprised her when she first arrived and had never become ordinary. She held her husband's hand on the porch of the house that stood on her land, and she was entirely, unambiguously, permanently home. The deed still named Covington. It always would.